to let a few more people join. All right, everyone, welcome to the R Ladies meetup for April. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm virtually joining from, the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that to any Torres Strait Islander people who may be present today with us virtually. So like I said, welcome to our April event. It's a really great pleasure to have Juliette O'Brien here as our guest speaking to us today. And she is going to be talking about data viz for mass audiences. Before we begin, we'd just like to, as always, if any of you from the community are interested in giving a seminar, workshop, or a short talk, please do get in touch. We will pop the link to the expression of interest form. Just fill out the form. It's really simple, really quick, but we'd love to hear from you if you have any ideas. So without further ado, I will introduce Juliette O'Brien, who is a digital and data journalist. She's the creator of covid19data.com.au, which I am sure many of you have accessed and heard of in the last couple of years. This is was Australia's first website tracking the COVID-19 pandemic and has been used by more than 3 million Australians, including many of us here today, I'm sure, as well as many news media, business, and government organizations. The site was a finalist in the Wall Street Journalism Awards in 2020 for innovation. Juliette is also the author of a national best-selling memoir, This is Gail, and she has worked at the Sydney Morning Herald, SBS, NITV, and Bauer Media, and she consults in digital strategy, communications, and data storytelling for different clients. She's now currently teaching and coordinating the data and computational journalism at the University of Technology in Sydney. And we're super pleased and excited to have you here, Juliette. And I'll let you share screen now.
Cool, thank you. Thanks so much, Shaz. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I'll just sort out this screen share. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up that you can see that title slide? Okay, awesome, thanks. Yay, okay. Now, I just literally put the finishing touches on slide 104. So I apologize if there are any errors in this, but there shouldn't be. Are you hearing dinging from my end? Is that annoying? I don't know how to stop you from hearing that, but also hear my voice.
It'll probably stop. It's people joining, so I think
okay, cool.
It'll probably die down in the next couple of minutes.
Unless there's a constant stream. Okay, awesome. Yeah, look, we'll probably leave questions to the end. I'm really useless at checking the chat while I'm talking, but I can see Shaz and a few of the R ladies. So if you need to get my attention, can you do it by like waving or like unmute, not in the chat, because I will miss that 100% of the time. Okay, data viz for mass audiences. So I'm going to run through the origins of the website, some of the impact, and then take you through some of the lessons that that I learned, I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Wangal people of the Eora Nation. I'm in Sydney, and that is the nation of the Sydney Basin. And I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands where I live and work. So origins of the website, as Shaz mentioned, my background is journalism, but it's always been digital journalism, not so much data journalism. And digital journalism and digital producers might work in a newsroom and work with editors and reporters to basically bring stuff together and get it up online. So I was on the breaking news desk casually at the Herald back in March 2020, was producing stories that were about COVID. I wanted to find a chart to produce it for, just to get it live on the website. Chart didn't exist, and the data didn't exist at that time. So our national cases were in the low 40s. So that's when, and the way that we were releasing that information were states and territories had press conferences, some media releases, there was some social media, but now we're so used to kind of dashboards and your daily tweets and everything. And it took months and months for us to get any sort of regularity with all of that. So there was just, we had live blogs, rolling headlines, and then the Federal Department of Health would publish the numbers on their webpage at 6 a.m. So by 11 p.m., it's sort of 18 hours out of date sort of thing. And in those sort of very tense times, people really wanted it faster. So as a data viz sort of scenario, globally, we had the Johns Hopkins dashboard. This image is from 5th of March 2020. That's what everyone was watching. And then we had the FT start their super well-known log charts now. But when I started tracking, Australia didn't even register on those charts. So it's one of those old things of, if you wish something existed, then make it yourself. So I started to track, basically I was tracking every single case individually, line by line in a Google Doc. And the original idea was for reporters in the newsroom to be able to add to the doc, which was obviously never going to work if we had exponential growth, but it was worth a try at the start. And I ended up tracking them all manually alone anyway. So this was the first chart, simple cumulative cases. And this was the breakdown of states. And that's what I had wanted to put in the original Herald article. So I set them up in a Google Doc spreadsheet. I fed the live Google Doc into about 5 charts made with Infogram, which was the chart tool that was used by the Herald. And then when we decided it wouldn't proceed for the Herald because it was too manual, I put them on my own little Wix site just to see where it went. And then I've just got a note here, in terms of tracking each case individually, at that point in time, they were releasing date, state, gender, age, transmission source, the country of origin, and the location. So those were the metrics that I was following. So site went live 11th of March 2020. On 13th of March 2020, I tweeted it to about 500 followers, and then it essentially went viral over the next couple of days, and it had 300,000 visitors in the next few days. So that's the first tweet where, I was just like, I've been tracking every case and here are a few little interesting things. And then that's really like Twitter made the site basically. So the first lesson was the power of Twitter, which 2 years ago I wasn't, I didn't tweet very much. Since then I checked out the metrics today because I try not to look at them because it gives me anxiety, but the website traffic is 3.6 million users since then. 3.4 million of them are Australians, 25 million page views. But I guess the website traffic isn't really the real measure of the impact, because part of the idea was with those infographics, and one reason why I like continuing to use Infogram and those chart libraries is that they are designed to have embeds. So like you can always download the data and embed it. And so it's this built-in virality, and that has really helped to disseminate the data more widely. I don't have adequate analytics about that. And like back in November 2021, like I had to check out how many times those infograms have been shown based on embeds in other websites. And it was sort of in the tens of millions back then. So, you know, that's sort of the idea. Here's a good example where that clusters chart, the Herald Sun and news.com picked that up. And so while on my side, I could see that the clusters page had 360,000 views. The infogram was saying that actual embed had been viewed 1 million times that sort of week sort of thing. So building in a way to make everything that you do easily shareable, like it just compounds impact. So yeah, like it's been, all of the stuff has been used in over 1,000 news or media articles. And the thing that I like about it is that it has crossed the political lines to an extent. It depends on then sort of what sort of angle or headline gets attached to the charts, but you know, it is good to have something that's being used by the breadth of the media spectrum. And I've had a good friend who's helped me keep track of all of the citations, and it's at the website on the In the Media page if you're interested in looking at it. And then the cool thing is always when the data has been used by you know, serious people, like at the Doherty, Grattan and Burnett Institutes, the Lancet, Medical Journal of Australia, New England Centre for Complex Diseases, all of those private sector organisations, like where it's used by companies and government departments, it's really hard to know and track. And the way that I kind of, I just don't really know, to be honest. And what happened was usually I just make it really easy to download the data, but there were certain charts where I couldn't do that. I think it was because the data wrapper plan at the time made me choose between an embed or a data download. So I said, contact me if you want to download the data. And in the first day, it was like strategy teams from like Woolworths and Kathmandu and JP Morgan all being like, can you send us that data? And I was like, yeah, here's the donation page, FYI. So, and then like I get all of these emails, you know, contacts from the site, and they've all got .gov.au email addresses, and they're like, where's that data that you were tracking? So it's funny. It's been interesting. It's been a wild ride. Now that was the thing that I just wanted to show in terms of the site going viral really at the start. This was really the major thing that people were interested in, which was showing what countries people had arrived in. And at that stage, our borders were open, but we had closed borders. And you can see it here, which is so, you know, you can see that cases from China flatlined, cases from Iran flatlined because we closed our borders to them. And meanwhile, cases from the US had eclipsed all of them, and our borders were still open to them. So that's one reason why people were like, that's quite good. And that was all tracked from publicly released information, either in press conferences or in the press releases. You know, today we have 8 cases, they flew in from blah, blah, blah. So just to take you under the hood really quickly, yeah, like, I mean, I took a beginner's course in R recently, and my dream is to be good with R, but this is Google Docs, and then it's fed live into Infogram, Data Wrapper, and Flourish, so 3 chart tools. Google Docs, I saw a really funny quote recently where it said, spreadsheets are like drugs. They start off fine and then they ruin everything. And that's it. That's Google Docs for sure. So like now it's just like trying to stuff 1,000 huge octopus into a box. But, and it really needs to have moved to SQL or something that is more robust, where I've effectively built a database, and then that needs to be feeding through. So would never do it this way again. But one reason why it stayed this way is I know that I can just push forward with it. And as I'll show you, the data has been constantly changing. So every time there's a change, I just need to be able to adapt. And so, this summer was going to be like the summer of like redoing the architecture and everything, but instead it ended up being Omicron, which just kind of broke things even further. So that's why it's sort of been locked like that for a couple of years. So in terms of collecting the data, a lot of it has been manual collection because of the changes in the formats and the distribution methods that I have been doing, like some scrapes where possible. I take feeds and then get alerts. But the big people who, like, I want to acknowledge Anthony McCarley, Miga, Ken Sang, and David Barry. David Barry has emailed me directly every single day for 2 years. We've met on Zoom once with transmission source data. So those guys use the tools that they're way better at it than me, and they share it, which has just been awesome. And then these have been collaborators at some point throughout the 2 years. So it's a bit of a hub and spoke model where I'm basically the producer and editor, and then people will get involved in different subject areas that they're interested in. So for instance, Liam Pearson here, he put together all the mobility data. Hugh Kennedy helped with LGA, helped with postcodes. Michael Resney actually got in there with me and was a producer with me, along with Carlos Montero for a while. Daniel Klein did all of the tracking for the cluster charts, which was all very manual. So, it's been a real collective effort. A Melbourne-based data science practice output AI labs got involved right at the start, and, helped me kind of get the log charts going when the data tools couldn't do that. They got data science students involved. The data science students didn't really like it because it was all too manual. But the UTS journalism students were happy with doing that manual work. So a few of them hung around. And then behind the scenes, the ABC Digital Story Innovation team and The Guardian, those guys have been super collaborative. Like, they've brought me and Anthony and others into their Slack channels. Because for a while it really was just like, have you got this? Have you found this for today? Have you found this? Because it was just also piecemeal. And that's a legacy of federation, right? Because it's just released by 8 different states and territories, and you're trying to track all the different metrics. So it's been a really nice sort of collaborative vibe behind the scenes. Now, there have been like countless challenges. And one of them is what I mentioned before, the changing data. And these are just a few examples. Now, I actually don't want to spend too long on all of this sort of stuff, but I just want to paint a picture of what the challenges have been. Now, when I say net, new, and true cases, like, literally, those are 3 different ways that cases are announced. And so this has been part of an issue with coming to terms with, it's data literacy, but it's also COVID data literacy. And it's been trying to build up all of our COVID data literacy. So people would often ping me saying, you've got this many cases today, but it's actually this many cases, and COVID Live has this many cases, that sort of thing. And it was always a symptom of true cases would come from their direct data sets, which is what I like to use. And that would go back to the notification date, which might be 2 or 3 days before the case was actually announced. New cases is just what they announced each day. And then net cases was what they actually added to their total. So if they were doing downwards revisions to cases because there were duplicates or whatever, they might say there were 64 new cases today, then they'd add 58 to the net. And then in their database, there would only be 43 or something. So I ended up tracking all 3. And just driving up this level of COVID data literacy ended up being a bit of a mission as well, which I did in terms of data notes around the site and Twitter. And then a couple of other examples are just, for instance, testing units. You know, for a long time we thought that it referred to individuals, how many people have been tested. Then we realized it's referring to tests. Then it changed back and forth to the point where Our World in Data and so on actually said Australian testing units are unclear. So all of that has been a challenge the whole way through. We've had patchy release of data the whole way through. For example, they'll mention numbers of people on ventilators. If it depends on the day of the week, like not even, like there's no pattern to it. Sometimes it'll be mentioned, sometimes it won't. Vaccines has been a really good example of the patchy release of data where it kind of gets revealed, it gets published as they want in a more of a media outreach sort of perspective. It's not about data release, it's about the media team and the public relations release. And so using media releases for data, that's created this patchy release. But also it does just come from the health departments as well. So the second point there, recoveries, if we look here, this is remaining active cases in each jurisdiction. There are just little blue arrows on where there are, you know, irregularities in the data where it's dropped off or it's gone up. And the reason why that's been important is because people have relied on the published active cases to try to calculate things like hospitalization rate. And so you can see that there was a pretty big difference in the hospitalization rate based on what they've determined is active. This was something that happened with the vaccines, where the federal government was ignoring our requests for daily vaccine data. We would literally have to hunt it down via ad hoc news reports, press releases, watching press releases, and randomly release JPEGs. Anthony McCarley, he was so thorough and reliable with that. Our World in Data was using his data, and then the federal government used Our World in Data to present the vaccine data, which was just infuriating. And then, of course, with the 8 states and territories, there are all of these idiosyncrasies with respect to individual jurisdictions. So New South Wales stopped declaring recoveries, it's just active cases. Queensland never even reported community spread when they had major outbreaks like before Omicron. WA and Queensland would always refer to historic cases, but it's just a different definition of what a historic case is. It doesn't necessarily refer to serology. Tasmania had a different reporting time until sort of end of last year. The list goes on and on and on. I guess a more recent thing, like it's still going on with WA reports deaths as historical when they mean from 3 days ago. So that's not something that New South Wales would call historical, for instance. So back in the start, I used to actually track, is it historical, is it today, because people wanted to know, but now we just know that like you just need to take those sorts of terms with a grain of salt. So yeah, I guess the thing that I've noticed is that we local data trackers have had to grapple with those sorts of granular details a little bit more, and it's partly been because the Australian public has been so engaged with this that that people will ask. So you have to chase all of the details and know what your decision is, put it in the data notes, give responses. And then, you know, like you'll see sort of New York Times or FT just say, this is the number, and they can keep it at very high level because they're taking that big global approach. Our World in Data, I have to say, even though they take a big global approach, they're incredibly engaged in the granular detail of each jurisdiction. So what have we learned about data viz from all of this? Okay, I've got like a bunch of like platitudes really and examples. And so if you want to dig into anything anymore or have any questions, then just like make a note and we can deal with it at the end. So the first thing is that I think it's very useful to distinguish very clearly to people between the difference of tracking, projections, modeling. And so the founding principle of COVID-19 data was I wanted to bring together all of these fragments of information and data that were technically but not practically available to the public and present them clearly with no editorial, no projections, and no charts that required significant assumptions. As soon as I put that out there, people really responded positively to that. And I think that's because editorial gets introduced in a lot of different ways. I absolutely have editorial in the choices of what to track and how to do that, how intensively to do it, where it's placed on the website. All of those are editorial decisions, but it's not an editorial decision like a written screaming headline and words like surge, you know, even those choices of verbs are all editorial introductions that influence and also raise people's anxieties. So I wanted to stay away from that. I didn't want to do any projections because I think that that area is so clouded and it's hard enough just working out what is actually going on without all of this introduction of what people think is going on or what they think is going to happen. And then there's this issue of significant assumptions. So, I mean, a lot of times I got asked, like I would get asked by media to, about my modeling. And I would always say, it's not modeling, right? It's maths. If there's any sort of a projection, and I'll go into this in a sec, but, you know, this idea that modeling would have to involve assumptions and expert knowledge and that sort of thing. But this term modeling also got a little bit confused. So the way I think about it is tracking, real-time data tracking is just trying to answer the question, what is actually happening now? And for me, that is a full-time thing to answer that question. And that's been full-time in COVID. And I think that would be beyond full-time in all kinds of areas, like what is happening right now in terms of health outcomes in certain parts of Australia, what's happening right now in terms of different climate metrics, you know, without joining these assumptions with it. Now, in terms of projections being maths, I'll talk about that in terms of the exceptions that I ended up having to make. So I guess the key thing, the big thing that I've learned is that counting is powerful, right? And now I'm facilitating the data journalism course at UTS, and some of the data journalists that we've been looking at, they've literally said the most powerful data journalism I've ever done in my life has literally just been counting and putting it out there. And so an example of that would be, you know, police brutality, gun deaths, you know, deaths in custody. The Guardian is doing a great job of that at the moment. So that's my first big thing. However, there were exceptions. So the first was the ref, which is the reproduction number. And I avoided including that on the site for a long time because you have to have some sort of an assumption in order to do that. Just by the by, this actually is now one of my favorite data vises, just because I think I just really like the way it shows so clearly how the ref impacts the cases. So the cases are the grey bars, and you can see as the ref, the yellow line bobs up and down above 1, below 1 and above 1. You can see it driving cases up or driving cases down. It's just so clear. So I decided Professor Adrian Esterman was always tweeting the ref. And so I asked him if I could use his calculation, which is fairly simple and straightforward, right? Like, so it's a 4-day ratio. So that's thinking about the incubation period of the virus. This is using a 7-day moving average. He used to use a 5-day moving average. So they're not, you know, they're not complicated things, but I I didn't want to have to take responsibility for making those decisions. And first of all, I don't want to have to read the journal articles to decide on the 4-day ratio. But more than that, I didn't want to have to defend it and get into the Twitter debates about whether or not it should be 4-day or 5 days. So that's why where I had to use this, I deferred to an expert. And I think that has worked really well. The second major exception I had to make was, and so I was talking to Norman Swan on RN Breakfast. It was like 6:15 in the morning. And like we'd done a pre-interview the previous day with a producer, right? And so I thought I had a pretty good handle on what Norman was going to ask. And then he was asking me about the ref. And he said, so where are we going to be in a month? You know, and that's like the classic Norman Swan question, I think, like, so what does this mean? What's going to happen? And I think that a lot of people say, I don't do predictions, and they refuse to answer it. But that experience really made me realize that just reporting the ref as a number, 1.1, 1.2, was actually not adequate from a data communication perspective. And so I collabed with the Herald, because we were at that time, we were on track. If you actually did the maths and used that basic calculation and pushed it out 30 days, you could just see in the maths that this is what track we were on, right? So the Herald published this story, and I did a little Twitter storm about this decision, that I've realized that simply reporting the ref fails in a principle of data journalism, which is actually to unpack the data's implications. So as much as we all thought we had wrapped our heads around the reproduction number, every time you told people this is what that means in 5 days, 10 days, 15 days, 20 days, people were shocked, surprised, because we do find it hard to wrap our heads around exponential growth. So I developed this thing that I call the if nothing changes analysis. And it's just maths, right? And I felt like that's not really betraying the founding principle of the website. And that people, the big thing is not betraying the trust of people, and that people feel comfortable with the concepts that you're saying, and there are no gaps in the logic for them. So I think talking to a mass audience, I have found that it's useful to say, this is what's happening, this is the fact, and if nothing changes, this means this is where we'll be. And that's easy for people to follow. So in that Herald article, this is where that went. So the expected daily cases based on, and here in purple, we've got a ref of 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. And that was the illustration for people of why we had a ref at that stage of 1.3, why those tiny changes in the ref can result in catastrophic differences in case numbers. And so that was also showing people the logic of the 2,200 cases per day within a few weeks. And the third key time that this has happened was then with vaccines, and especially because we had restrictions and lockdowns that were tied to vaccine targets, there was understandably huge demand to know, when are we going to reach the target? And so this is what anyone who was doing the forecasts, they were essentially using similar models, which is, this is very simply taking every single day, I take the 7-day average, and if that 7-day average continues, this is where we'll be. So this ended up having to, the one problem with that was, you had a 7-day average for first doses and a 7-day average for second doses. And our true 7-day average would end up being somewhere in the middle, because one would either be quickening or slowing depending on where we were. So that's why I had this sort of gray area. But, you know, that was another place where I had to have a forecast. But again, there was a note at the top of it saying, if nothing changes, this is where we'll be. And so this is what I have today. I'm doing it for boosters. And this could definitely be improved. The New York Times had a really good version where it was similar, but they would keep the lines as it changed. So then you can see it shifting down or shifting up, depending on if the rate is getting faster or slower. So that would be good. But at this stage, I've just kept it like that and just push it out. And it's quite interesting, you know, to look at the booster uptake and how much that slowed in different jurisdictions. And, you know, WA's booster rate is so far ahead other jurisdictions. So, you know, that'll be worth a little Twitter storm, I think. So, yeah, just to recap, so tracking remains the core focus of the website. And that's about answering what is happening. Projections, I think, and if nothing changes, analysis is really palatable within the world of tracking. And then modeling, I say that it requires expert knowledge, collaboration, and transparency just on what are the assumptions that are baked in here. So that's the first thing. The second thing is be obsessively user-focused. So with every single visualization, and I'm the first to admit that these, you know, some of the visualizations are god-awful, but I at least try. And the two questions that I ask, and I would really do this at the height of the different waves when there were many more people coming to the site. First, if someone comes to the website today, what do they want to know or understand? And what's the fastest way of getting that information to them? So those are the two questions. And then I would figure out what I would want to see or know, and then work backwards in terms of getting the visualization to show that. So here's one little example. During the height of the outbreaks, it was totally clear that there were a few key users or key personas, and people were so engaged, people would want the daily numbers straight away. Some people were coming back every few days. So they sort of wanted a weekly wrap. People then wanted context. They wanted to know where this number fit into the wave. And then there was always this question, and one of my collaborators, Daniel Klein, said this to me actually. He was like, I just want to know if it's getting better or worse. And that was actually during Victoria's second wave, when the numbers are still huge, but growth was slowing, right? And so this was another thing that the public had to wrap its head around in terms of data literacy and COVID data literacy, is that you have slowing growth, and that's good, right? And then growth slows until it plateaus. So the solutions there, and this was all just kind of knocked out in the moment during the Vic second wave, I think, were a daily briefing up the top. And I ended up needing to have that and move away from charts because I needed to be able to show where there was a zero. And also this was a quick reference for people to be able to see, oh, okay, you know, Tasmania hasn't, the cases aren't listed yet for today. So that hit people up with what changed each day. Then there was a super clear, you know, this shows the last 8 days. So if you were looking at global dashboards, you wouldn't find many dashboards that are for some reason showing the last 8 days. But in the Australian context at that point in time, this is the sort of thing people wanted. And the reason why it's only 8 days is because this made sure that the numbers were still visible, right? So people then didn't have to tap to see the number. They could just glance at it, and they seemed pretty happy with that. And all of this happened by feedback. People would be like, can you remove a couple of days from that chart so that the numbers are showing again? And then I'd forget, and then they'd say, can you remove another day, please? You know, so then needed to make it easy for people to see all of the data and see where we were tracking in terms of the overall wave. And then in terms of, is it getting better or worse? I ended up hating this chart, but it was good for a few weeks where this was the growth rate. And so this was where this showed people that cases were still climbing, but the blue, the growth rate was actually coming down. So even though here, this would have been causing anxiety for people if all they could see were the cases climbing, they could see that the growth rate had been coming down, okay? And I haven't included it here, but one of the little things that I ended up putting around all the time was how to read this chart, because I made a lot of presumptions at the start that people would just work it out. And it's just so much better to tell people how to read the chart. And that also, the other thing that I had to change was being verbose in telling people how to read it. So my data notes page has it's like 20,000 words or something. It's ridiculous. And no one's going to find their way through it. And the effective communication was really about, just being as succinct as possible and really trying hard not to give any information that was too much. I guess I've realized that I have left it out of the slides, but my big lesson in terms of data literacy was that, and I say this, I'm just going to say it. I don't mean to sound rude. It's that people are not as smart as you think they are. That's my huge lesson. Because I thought as well, I would get emails from people and their email signature says something like rocket scientist or something like that, literally astrophysicist, but they would be engaging with me about these fairly simple issues of clarity, is it getting better or worse? And I just think that even heaps of medical professionals use my data. And when I've seen the dashboards that they put together for their staff and teams, they're the simple charts that we're all looking at. It's what's going up and what's going down. So yeah, that's my huge takeaway, is to keep it simple, especially for a mass audience, even if that audience involves specialist knowledge. Here's another example of thinking about what do the audience want to see and trying to make it simpler for them. So here are the total vaccine doses delivered in Australia. This chart, I hate this chart, but it's there, it exists. So here's a line to show the 70 and 80%. And someone wrote to me and they were like, can you please just show it in percentages, not in raw numbers, because the raw numbers don't mean a huge amount. So that's a really good idea. So next time it's the same chart, but here on the left, you can see that it's just tracking in the percentages. And if you run it along, you can see the percentages that have been vaxxed at any point in time. So a small decision like that, not raw numbers, percentages, made a big difference to the users. Okay, the second thing is ask and listen, what I've been talking about. Pretty much every development with the website has been either inherently obvious because it's totally newsworthy or suggested by the users. And right from day dot, users have contacted the site with feedback and ideas from the beginning. I literally still have emails that are unopened from that first month because it was just hundreds and hundreds. But I had to start opening them and make sure I stayed on top of them, even though I couldn't reply, because the user suggestions were pretty much always ahead of the curve. And so even though it is a mass audience, but it was also a very engaged and discerning audience. And they would say, first our focus was cases, and then soon it became recoveries. And users were the first people to say, let's hear how many recoveries there are, how many active cases there are. When the COVID Safe app was released, how many downloads have there been? So I would always listen to users, and that would direct the next chart on the site. The other good thing about listening to the users is that for the most part, then that these are not vanity metrics. And I would also get feedback about how people are using this data, because they are assessing risk in their own lives, for their families, their own health, and very often for their businesses. So this was how many days since when we had chased COVID zero, achieved it, and then every state kind of had cases popping up, but then we were driving them down, trying to get back to COVID zero. And so people who owned businesses, like I had someone write to me and say, I mean, I don't fully understand the logic of this, but they were like, I'm not opening my Tai Chi school until there are X number of days without a local case, right? So they want somewhere, they want a dashboard to go to, and they can just see how many days it's been since there's been a local case. And everyone who's tracking data, ABC included, all had this how many days since. So that's an example of the users wanted it, the data trackers created it. And the sad thing was that with all of these user requests, sometimes I'd be like, no, like I know that's what you want to see, but that's the harder option. And quite often the harder option was the better option. So here's an example. I really like this. One of the many contact forms that I received. This guy goes, I like this site. I really do, but I don't give a rat's ass what the New South Wales government deems an active case. Any current case of COVID in New South Wales overseas or not needs to be tallied as an active case. So basically what had happened was New South Wales says this is how many active cases there are, and then they just decided not to include overseas acquired cases because they were in hotel quarantine. So there is some sort of logic there. So they're saying these are the active cases in the community, but then every other state and territory has active cases that are both locally acquired and overseas acquired. So we didn't actually have visibility of how many active cases there were in New South Wales. So my solution to that was I broke them all up so that you could see, and this is on the site now, so you can see your hotel quarantine actives and your locally acquired actives. And then with New South Wales, I just set up a little function that was taking in the last 14 days of announced overseas cases. And so if a case had been announced as overseas acquired in hotel quarantine, I counted it for 14 days, which is generous, probably 10 days by the time they announced it would have been better. And that just indicated roughly how many active cases there were in hotel quarantine as well. So you can see here around 25th of June, the active cases just suddenly dropped because they stopped reporting overseas cases. And then I added the overseas cases back on and it brought it roughly back up. So that was just another user request. Okay, how have audience expectations changed after the pandemic? There are four things that I think that have really stood out to me. The first is timeliness and speed. So, you know, with going back, ABS data, for instance, it's like, and this is what happened in 2017. And we're like, great, you know, like what's happening now? And I think that there is less tolerance for that really old data. At least I hope that there is. And part of this is that all of the COVID data has been news, and part of like, so in terms of what constitutes as news is timeliness and urgency is one key factor. So in all of the COVID data reporting, there really has been a huge urgency to stay on top of it. Practically, I mean, I've lost count of the number of days that were just derailed for me personally, because you'd have a day planned and then suddenly something happened, and you'd have to sort of sort it out straight away. So one example, I think I've got this in here, is vaccine allocations, the allocations of Pfizer, and where there seemed to be inequity in the different states that had got Pfizer. And so it's like, okay, well, you can put that data together and, you know, get some sleep and release that data next week. But the public wanted that data immediately, right? So then, like, as soon as the government released the data, like, then you have to build the data set and get it up. So I think this real-time tracking sort of thing is kind of a new thing for the wider public. And it's something that I think people sort of expect now. And I think that's a good thing. So in COVID-19 data on the website, every single chart and view was designed to meet a particular moment in the news cycle, really. It was that it had come to the top of the public's attention, and that's why it appeared. The second thing that I think has changed is transparency. So I release all of my data. You can see it all. And I found that so let's go to the vaccine forecasts. This started with a story on 7:30, and it was, we weren't given a data source. Like, I'm a big admirer of 7:30, but in that instance, there was no source, and it was like leaked or something, you know, it was like leaked data. And then even the data itself, they didn't release the raw data so that other people could access it and see their calculations. And so then at the end, you just have this thing of data show that Vic is getting, you know, copying a bad deal, basically, paraphrasing Laura Tingle. For me, it caused this huge furor on Twitter because people couldn't see it, and people want to be able to get to the truth themselves. So then the Herald and the Age got the same data. They released it, which was awesome. And so my solution was to chart it, right? And so you can see down the bottom, it says, get the data. All of the maths and the logic and the thinking were there. And so it was in the pink, what are the actual Pfizer deliveries to date? And in the blue, what would be expected if it were equitable? Sorry, I'm not sure why that word extra is there. Expected extra. I can't remember. But anyway, it's the difference between equity and actual. So we can see there that Vic should have got this many Pfizer. In actuality, they got the pink line, and compare that with New South Wales. Or the expected extra was because then the feds had actually announced we are giving extra because of this huge Delta outbreak in New South Wales and whatnot. So you had to calculate, what did they actually get? What should they have received based on their population? What should they have received based on the announcements? So the question was, did they get more than what the government even announced? And you know, I think that if you're transparent about it, you can see, you know, you don't have to have a huge debate over whether or not it's true or false on Twitter. You have all of the data, you show all of the calculations, and then you present it in a viz. And I think that's an expectation of people now. And that's certainly like the expectation that I try to set. And so at the top of those charts, you know, there's an explanation. All data and that final sentence, all data and calculations underlying these charts are available to view and download here, right? The third thing that I think people expect now is history. And I'm not going to use my site for this. I'm going to use the site of one of my friends and collaborators, Anthony McCarley, who's a Melbourne guy, Migger on Twitter, who does COVID Live. And so he has the simplest way for people to view history. And I think that people really expect that now. So here's an example of Victoria's daily summary. You can click on each of these words and it'll go through to more detail. And then you can click even more, and every single category has a history like that. And it is so clear, like you can't hide anywhere. And so you can get to that full history actually just by one click from the homepage. So I think history is another expectation, and then interactivity as well. So sometimes I find that I go to like a government site and I like click on one of the little icons thinking that it's going to select or deselect something, and nothing happens. And I'm like, that's crazy. But here's an example, like a lot of people asked for this. And do you know what? Flourish, one of the chart tools, like all of these huge chart tools, they've also had this huge period of rapid iteration in terms of their products in the last 2 years, because I started using Flourish, then I couldn't use it because it didn't offer particular features. And then when I returned to it like a year and a half later, all of those features were there. So one of them was this selecting the log or the linear view. I mean, I got asked that so many times in the early months of the pandemic, and I couldn't provide it because none of the chart tools had it. But now that's a really simple change. And also, I know that this annoys people where they constantly have to deselect rather than select, but you know, it's an out-of-the-box tool. But just this idea of being able to isolate the different states and territories, like that's just the most basic level of interactivity. And for example, so this is Tasmania. So you can see that Tasmania gets totally lost here in the collective national view. And it's just like crucial for people to be able to deselect it and get a clear view of it. So those are the 4 key things that I think people, from my experience, they really expect over the last 2 years. Another huge lesson that I've learned is in the visualizations, obviously tell a story. That's a really obvious thing to say, but you know, the temptation to do a data dump should always be resisted, I think. Well, not always, but for the most part. So the picture has to tell a story, but also my goal, and one of my collaborators who is dead in long run on Twitter, he articulated this to me, and I think it's beautiful. It's enable the self-discovery of the logic. And now that is actually my guiding sort of principle for data viz. And I think in, you know, this world where facts are questioned and slippery and everything, enabling people to self-discover the logic is hugely powerful. And this is the principle that I want to apply to all kinds of data viz and different topics. So this is obviously not my chart. This is from the Wall Street Journal, but it's one of the most powerful charts. And actually a guy called Hung Vo, who I did my R beginners course with a couple of weeks ago, he showed this. I hadn't seen it before. And this was made in R. Yeah, I mean, talk about telling a clear story, hey? And so, you know, it's a heat chart with very simple annotation. And that's a magic recipe, I think. And actually, John Murdoch from the FT, he has said that annotation is one of the most valuable journalistic contributions that they make in terms of data visualization. Like FT charts are about annotations. So that's something else that's interesting as well, and something that I've had to think about in terms of this being a little bit too precious about not having any editorial and being flexible with that to allow annotations. So here's Shaz's favorite chart. And this shows clusters in Melbourne's, in Victoria's second wave. And honestly, when I started tracking this, so I did this with the help of Daniel Klein, who's a programmer in Melbourne. He went through every single press release, you know, and I would listen to Brett Sutton's press conferences and just literally type it in. And when we started, down the left here, this is the Cedar Meats outbreak, that grey one. And that was the huge outbreak. And obviously, like, so the word there is explosion. And at the time, the very interesting thing about that was we as a community had been talking about cases from an unknown source. So there was this idea of, oh, there are cases there, but we know the source, so it's okay. We only have to be worried about these cases where we don't know the source. But the Victorian second wave showed that cases from a known source, these are all known clusters, that if that leads to this huge explosion of cases, then it is uncontrolled spread no matter what, right? This was another one that ended up telling a very clear story. And this was where New South Wales literally had to hold the line. That was one of the, that was said in one of, like Gladys Berejiklian said that. So, you know, they were sort of, it was this different approach to restrictions. And it was like pulling restrictions here and there, but no huge lockdown. And it was all about whether or not we could hold the line in cases. And if they got away from us, then we would need to introduce restrictions. So we could see the question again and again is always, are we following the path of someone else? And that's why I think comparisons are always really useful, because they are inherent context. So you can just tell people the case numbers, but it's super useful to then be able to say, how does this compare? Are we Victoria, but 3 weeks behind? And this chart shows very clearly that we were not, that we were on a different path. And this one was getting a little bit messy because people got really tetchy about the starting point that I would use for the outbreak. So the light pink and the purple are the same outbreak. They're both Victoria's Delta outbreak, but it's using a different starting point. Like, which day do you think this outbreak started? And at the end of it all, it doesn't matter, right? But when we were sort of here in around day 54, it kind of mattered because people wanted to understand how New South Wales and Victoria compared at the same point in the outbreak. But in terms of including them both, I was able to do that because I think just showing it to you cold here is, it's confusing. It looks messy, but this was on a page that people visited every single day and people were really engaged with it and people appreciated. And there was a message at the top that I don't know what the starting date of the outbreak is, okay? So let's play it both ways and be fully transparent about that. And look, it sounds like it doesn't matter, but it does end up mattering because then media pick it up and will use it and say, whatever, Dan Andrews doesn't know what he's talking about because look at how much worse Victoria is doing, when really if you shifted the start date, it's a totally different story. So that's why that happened. And then this is like the classic log chart that FT really started. And it's not interesting now, but it's interesting when it's around here in the early days. And you can see, and this is where, we've now got this term flatten the curve and bend the curve and everything. And this is exactly, I had a big chart like this that showed the different states and territories on the homepage at the start. And that's what you couldn't see anywhere else. And that's what people wanted to see. They were just watching that every day to see the cases bend around because the chart tells a story. And it also tells a story not only about cases, but it tells a story about society and what is happening and what restrictions there are and how people are behaving to change these curves. So I think that's really interesting. And the most recent one was decoupling, where that was something that we really wanted to start to see visually. And I really wanted to find a way to visually represent that. And when I say decoupling, I mean that, like, let's use the chart to explain it. The black dotted line show the number of active cases. So then the first principle there is don't use the active cases that the states and territories had released. This was a calculation based on the last 12 days of cases or something like that, so that it was consistent. So that's something that I would have to explain to the viewers. Then hospitalizations. In the first wave, we can see it, active cases and hospitalizations are tracking against each other. In the second wave, they're tracking against each other. And in this third wave, we can see that the hospitalizations peel off while the active cases keep going straight up. So in order to do that, I basically did it was a lot of, just trial and error. But I decided the best way was to have a locked in ratio. So I've got two y-axes. I know that that's like, breaking like a cardinal rule sort of thing, but I've had to use two y-axes a lot just because of the amount of data on the site and the amount of things that people want to know and an economy of space. If I had to put this as two separate charts side by side, it would affect site speed you know, like suddenly you've got 10 heavy infograms on a page rather than 5. So that's why I often resulted to 2 y-axes, and I'd always kind of have a red alert. I would still get lots of comments from people saying you shouldn't do that, but so I locked those axes in at a ratio of 10:1, and that is how I could lock in the active cases and the hospitalizations with each other, and make sure that I haven't created this decoupling myself, like that it exists because it's consistent across the entire pandemic, really. So it's really a comparison throughout the pandemic. So that was just about trying to find a visual way to capture the story, which is that vaccines are working. So social media. I think social media is amazing for native data viz, and also when I say asking questions, I mean like explainers, like talking people through the data and through the questions. So those are the 2 amazing things. So in terms of native data viz, here's a great example. With Victoria last year, do you remember how it's just so funny. Like, we used to talk about cases, then we used to talk about local versus overseas cases. Then it was, are they from a known or an unknown source? And then last year it ended up being, okay, they're known, but were they in quarantine or isolation during their infectious period? And that was really the last key metric that we were focused on for COVID-0. And this fairly simple thing ended up going off on Twitter, which was, the target is 100% of today's cases in isolation. And we could see it creeping up, 8% of the cases, 69, 73, 92. There was a bit of a toggle, how many of the cases were in ISO. And then when we reached 100%, there was, not quite a donut day celebration, but there was like a celebration. So I think that's interesting from a data viz perspective, that these sorts of vertical lists and things have become quite useful on Twitter, and people use them quite a lot. And then I haven't got the full thread here, but this was a good example of talking people through mobility data. And this thread got a lot of traction because there was criticism about Sydney being in lockdown, but we still had these really high rates of mobility. And Google, Citymapper, and Apple Maps all released mobility data, but people didn't really understand what it said, because it would say things like -15%. So this was an explainer thread to explain. And the reason why I've got this tweet here is I've got heads up to understand these charts. There are a few tweets of pre-reading. So this idea of getting a large audience to do pre-reading to understand a chart, like this was a little bit of an experiment on my part, and it went really well. But then the other point of it, of doing this on Twitter, is, I don't know how many people might have seen this, like maybe 20,000, right? But the point of Twitter is that among that 20,000 are sort of influential people in terms of what they know and they understand, then gets filtered out further. So, and journalists really, who they themselves didn't understand this issue, the issues around mobility data. And so just to explain to you really quickly, it's about the baseline and what is the baseline, and just understanding that Google measured the baseline in January and February 2020 sort of thing. And so that is a gauge of what is regular mobility at all of these different locations. And so understanding that point in time in your own local context is what's necessary. And so we can see here that red line, which is the NT, is really high, whereas VIC is really low. So we're saying NT is way above the baseline for retail and recreation, and VIC is way under the baseline for retail and recreation. Well, you have to understand that in January, that's the wet season in the NT. So you have a low baseline of mobility in the NT for retail and recreation. And so now it's way above that. you know? So I promise I explained that a lot better in the thread, but that was a point. Collaborating with news media. So here's just an example. There are a gazillion examples. So this is the AFR, right? Source COVID-19 data using our charts. The reason why they have done that is I released everything under Creative Commons 4.0 right at the start. And so, you know, I think a lot of people release things under Creative Commons 3.0, which is where you can use it for education or for non-commercial purposes. 4.0 includes commercial purposes, right? And you're saying you can even make a profit out of my work. And that was the decision that I made right at the start. I think a lot of other data trackers then followed that approach. And that is because you need to ask yourself, what is the goal? And if the goal is reaching more people, and also building up authority of your own work, then why limit it to non-commercial use? It does get a little bit grating, I admit, when huge for-profits use it and don't make any contribution. But my opinion is, I always get something, even if, so the Herald Sun, news.com, lots of Murdoch papers use it. That's the AFR, you know, like they charge what, like $4 for, like, I can't afford the AFR, right? That's why I don't read it. So they can all use it, but I get something from that. And actually you would pay, a lot of, you know, PR companies pay for that sort of editorial coverage. The difference is the JP Morgans and the Citibanks and the EYs, where I actually can't see what I'm getting out of that. That's my only kind of question in terms of just giving away your intellectual property and like your visualizations and the data, right? Like that's the other big thing that I give away. This is like a public health emergency. COVID is sui generis. It's in a category all on its own. That's what I think. So it's okay if those, you know, if those huge corporates want to use my work. I'm not sure. I'm stepping my way through this at the moment for the next project. I'm not sure I want to do it in that same way again for those corporates, but I think it's okay to release it under 4.0 for media because you still get something from media using your work. So that is where the collaborations have come from. And that's why SMH and The Age used my data every single day for like a year and a half, because they're a for-profit company. And if I had have made it 3.0, that wouldn't have happened. And then the authority and the reach wouldn't have been as great. So yeah, that's really the huge thing that I say to consider. And then I just wanted to acknowledge some of the things that I've learned from some of the other data nerds. And I'm sorry for using that term. I kind of use it ironically because the AFR used it about us as data nerds. And I was like, it called us young data nerds. And I was like, well, thank you for calling me young and for calling me a nerd, because obviously, you know, people kind of want to be nerds these days. But so I hope I don't offend anyone by using that. So Miga, Anthony McCarley, COVID Live. The table, oh my God, like before him, I would never use a table. It was all about charts, but the table has been like so powerful throughout the pandemic. And especially I think in circumstances where people are really quite engaged in the details, they often don't want, bells and whistles, they want the information. So here are a couple of tables that I put on. But I can't resist. Like I want like a little bit of visualization in it. So I think these spark lines here in the testing, I think spark lines are brilliant. And I think they are underused. They're all getting a bit squashed here because our 7-day average is so huge. But, you know, I think like the idea of sparklines is for them to almost be like text, like you can have it embedded into text. So I would always, and it just says so much, just like in such a tiny little line, right? Like we can see that SA is going up, we can see that SWA is going down. So I reckon tables with spark lines are going to be the next big thing. And heat charts within a table. So I've learned that tables are very effective. Info packing, I'm not very good at it, packing as much information as possible into one chart. That's why I have an entire website. But there are some, data viz people out there who are really good at it. One of them is Dead and Long Run, who's on Twitter. And I think this is a fantastic example of packing a lot of information into one chart. So this is the New South Wales LGAs. And, it's this issue, it shows which direction the LGAs are going in, for one thing. So we've got this sliding chart tool that shows where it was and where it is. But then also Dead in Long Run developed this concept of social distancing. So one case in however many residents. So the amount of work behind this chart is enormous because first of all, you've got the number of cases in the previous 14 days. You've got the percentage change from this 14 days over the last. We can see which direction it's going in. And then down the bottom, we've also got this thing of how many, like what's the per capita analysis. So one in how many residents have an active case, right? Like they have caught COVID in the last 14 days. And then on top of that, he introduced this idea of 1 in 1,000 is like the equivalent of, 1 in 10,000, and then 1 in 2,500 is the equivalent of a friend of a friend. 1 in 200 is the equivalent of a friend of the family, and 1 in 50 is a direct contact, a friend. One case in 200. Sorry, I'm muffling that up a little bit because one case in 200 for a family of 4. So that means that someone in your family probably knows someone that has COVID right now. Okay, so it's this sort of interesting way to introduce different stratas of LGAs, and that was very interesting during the Delta outbreaks last year because it was about risk. And Dead in Long Run actually received feedback that it convinced some people to get vaccinated, which is pretty amazing. And then, sorry, I did have one more, which was just this idea of grunt work being a competitive difference. And to be honest, I think that's what I have done. Like it's really offering grunt work for other people, but another person is DB Raven, who did these amazing visualizations of outbreak mapping, and the amount of work that would have gone into tracking all of that would have been immense. But yeah, like, if you have the mind that can digest all of that information and visualize it, like that, it's all publicly available, but worth the time, I think. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening. I think the attrition rate wasn't too high. But yeah, happy to take any questions that you might have. I'll stop sharing.
Amazing. Everybody, I think, just found that fascinating. I'll read out a comment from the chat because I know you said you can't see the chat. So this was from Linda. She said, this was when you were talking about the if nothing changes charts. So she said, I think that's a really important lesson. If nothing changes for COVID, equates to if we don't take better precautions, and understanding the implications of that is central to policy development and also people's adherence to public health measures. I think it's hugely important reporting. And she's since had to leave, but said, thank you so much for amazing talk and absolutely fascinating talk.
Oh, thank you so much for that. That is such a good point. That's right. That's really interesting about the if nothing changes, because then it relates to policy and decisions. So yeah, no, I really
and I like the comment. I mean, I commented back just saying that was super insightful, because I think it is about adherence as well, and like, oh, is everything actually okay or is it not, and are we on track to keep things okay or not, and how will that actually influence people's behavior?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, part of that, like the huge lesson from the pandemic is like we have struggled with that, where you can literally see the results a few weeks later, you know, and it has been so contentious and difficult. And so our ability to do that for climate change is very concerning.
Yeah. Totally. I'll welcome any questions from anyone in the chat or comments. Feel free to unmute or type or raise your hand.
That's right. Camera's on. That's the only problem with Zoom. Like, it's kind of like you're going to your meetup like this. Don't you think? It's like, get the blanket off your head. Sorry, guys. No, you can do what you want.
No, I agree. I mean, I've been on both ends of that. Like when you're speaking, you're like, oh, I wish I could just see people's reactions and like if they're engaged or not. But then sometimes you're like, oh, I just want to eat my dinner. I not have people watch me eat my food.
So true.
Okay, I have a question for you. How did you keep your energy up all this time? Because I mean, I started collecting data. I ran out of steam in like 3 months, and make my own R app.
Oh wow.
But I mean, you've kept this up for so long. I mean, how did you keep your energy?
So much manual die.
I know.
It's amazing, Juliette.
That is such a good question, Diane. And actually, it all goes back to the early days when I made that fateful decision to put a donate button on the website. And so, I mean, you know, it was meant to be for the Herald. It was sort of abandoned, and then it kind of became like a Pretty Woman sort of moment where like you want to go back and say, remember me? Huge mistake. But then when the website went viral and I got all of this traffic, I was like, oh my God, I better find a way to monetize it. Like, honestly, that was one of my first thoughts. And I couldn't put Google ads on the site because it was just iframe embeds. So the Google crawlers didn't see any content on the site. So that's when I thought, oh, I'll put a little donate button on and hopefully it'll cover the costs. And people were phenomenal. So like $30,000 poured in like the space of a few weeks. And like it stopped, I'll tell you, but whenever there were waves, there would be more. And that locked me in for the long term. And that also meant, yeah, I just felt a huge sense of obligation to keep doing it after that. So when you can see that people have contributed money voluntarily and then they're returning to the site, like even now, 2 years later, sometimes the site is out of date because like I'm working, and so it might be out of date by like 6 hours. And my uncle was like, 6 hours is the most. I'm like, oh, I freak out if it's out of date by that much, you know, because of those people. So people were phenomenal in donating. Yeah. And that's where the energy comes from.
I'm going to read out a few comments from the chat. So this is from Matt. And this is exciting, very timely for an R Ladies session to kind of go full circle. So Matt says, for anyone interested in easy ingestion of Juliette's core data into R, can I give a plug to COVID-19 datahub.io, which provides R and Python packages of global COVID data. The Australian data in these is Juliette's, updated daily via my GitHub. So all of those links are in the chat for those who are interested. And yeah, awesome work to get that into R.
Is that, oh, that's not me. That's the amazing Matt Bolton, who I think, Matt, is that you?
Yeah, Matt B. Matt B. I think
he
might be driving, I think, or something.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Matt.
Oh, yes.
Yes, you're
yeah, amazing.
Right. So Matt, you might not have seen your name did appear on one of the slides, but that's a really good point. That so
hey, Juliette, and thanks for that.
Thank you so much, legend.
It's been great working with you.
You're the best. So
Amazing.
Matt got in touch with me because like I just had little download buttons, right? And like if anyone needed to access it, all I could say was, I can give you access to Google Sheets. That's all I can do. And Matt had the skills to do it. And so he has, been taking my sheets and turning them into, basically, making machine readable, all of that, and creating with these R and Python packages. And occasionally I'll get an email, like I got one that time from like someone from London University or something. So that has made my data way more accessible to institutions around the world, thanks to Matt.
Amazing.
So thank you.
Amazing. Next comment is from Lizzie. Outstanding presentation, Juliette. Really impressive amount of work by yourself and fantastic to see the work itself has gone viral. And thanks, Diane, for asking my exact question. So yes, I think we're all wondering that watching your presentation, just how you kept up the energy. And just such a service, I think, to the whole community. So thank you for that.
Oh, seriously, I'm just sitting here in my pajamas, just tapping away. It's like nothing, but thank you so much. And it's so cool to be able to do things like this,
Yeah, amazing. I'm sure everyone can take away so much in different ways from different angles. Any other questions from anyone else? I know that we're at 7 p.m. and everybody's probably hungry, but any pressing questions?
I know you were mentioning how it's hard when the numbers are slightly different from state to state or country to country. How do you handle that? Do you just put the best disclaimers and information that you can on the slide, or do you have a more systematic thing that's like tracked and updated, or how did you handle that? Discrepancies?
That's such a good question, because that's actually a huge issue in lots of areas because of us being in a federation of states and territories, where the states and territories have a lot of responsibility. So I guess the key thing that I'd say is, and there's something that I would do differently here, is you have to make a decision at some point. So sometimes I would introduce like another variable or metric into a chart. So for instance, you have your 8 states and territories, and then you have a 9th option, and that is, for instance, New South Wales, if it were equivalent to the others. So I might have something like a New South Wales 1 and a New South Wales 2, and then all the other states and territories. And so that example that I was showing with New South Wales excluding hotel quarantine cases, that's one where I can say, I would always say this is what they're saying. So you start with the facts of, this is the information that we're given. This is the information if it were normalized to the rest of the states and territories, and this is how I do it. The thing that I would do differently is in terms of my data notes, I kind of started this big indexed thing where you would have an index at the top, and then you could go and find whatever it was that you want. And I think a really powerful combination now is of, you have your data viz, and then you have a live blog. And I would personally always have ABC live blog and my own data viz open. And I would feel like I understood everything. And so in terms of the live blogs, next time I would have a change log, just like a technical change log for development, and use that to record all of these data notes so that people can go through it chronologically. Or then if you can find a way to introduce metadata and tag them as well, that would be really, really powerful.
Thanks, Nick, for your question. And your question has reminded Lizzie of another question that she had. How about the amendments to past data?
So, like retrospective revisions.
Yes.
I love exclamation mark, retrospective revisions. Yeah, that was a big thing. So I learned the hard way not to, well, it's hard to describe. So one thing I'm thinking of are transmission sources and cases, right? And so in the early days, looking at Victoria's dashboard, cases changed all the way back. Like I'd be looking at the daily cases from 2 months ago, and the daily cases changed the whole way through. And so monitoring that, I learned not to just overwrite the data, but to actually keep track of what's happening. And so with that, for instance, David Barry keeps all the revisions. So we have a track record of what was reported every single day and how that was different from what they reported the day before. So I hope that answers your question, Lizzie. But yeah, I say keep revisions.
I'm muted. I remember seeing a lot on Twitter, like people just kind of, oh, these two were from blah, blah, you know, they were misclassified or, you know, all of these things. And it was just such a, I mean, I guess something we deal with a lot just with big databases and epi data, but yeah, complicated to communicate, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, and to be honest, I didn't even bother trying to communicate that until that was happening in Victoria. So that had been happening the whole way along. And I think that like I had like a Sun Herald reporter say to me, well, a revision is a mistake, right? Like they've made a mistake. And I think that our expectations of what's actually happening in these health departments can be a little bit unrealistic. And, you know, the reality of getting these people tested, getting the case confirmations, all of the different processes that goes to the different departments, and then to get to like your data set, I think it's a bit unreasonable, to be honest, to expect all of that to happen seamlessly within sort of 12 hours, nonstop for 2 years. So I never made a big deal about that. But then, yeah, like in that period of time, people started to get really hung up on retrospective revisions. So I always just interpreted that as that's just what you're going to get. Now, I can see the comments here, and Lizzie said, so not just daily updates, but daily updating of the previous days too. Oof. Yeah.
So I'll just read out the question just because of the recording, because
sure.
Not everyone can see the chat. So I'll just read out the question from Christine. Great presentation. Thanks, Juliette. When the pandemic becomes a distant memory, like 20 years from now, how do you plan to store and future-proof the data?
I don't know. That's a really good question, Christine. I heard Ken Sang was asked a similar question, and he said I'll probably archive the site. But I actually want to I'm basically with a few collaborators, we're pushing forward to try to do more public interest data tracking. So it's quite possible that this could just be folded into a bigger site that continues and looks at other areas of health and climate and so on in a similar way, where it's about your real tracking, transparency, history, all of that.
That would be very cool. If no one else has any other questions or comments, I might end on probably a heavy question to finish off. But I'm just curious from your perspective, you know, how do we, or, you know, your opinion on this, how do we think about data viz and communication, and especially obviously I'm from an epidemiology perspective and public health, how do we deal with the public fatigue with COVID? And, how can we deal now with this perhaps misunderstanding that, everything's fine, COVID's over, let's just move on. Whereas, I think the reporting maybe has changed slightly, but do we need to just change it completely in a way that communicates that, no, this isn't over. No, it's still not okay. We still need to get boosters. We still need to worry about the rest of the world, all of these other issues. And I'm really curious how
good question. Like I've definitely, I really struggled because with Omicron and that summer, I was like at the financial point where I had to dial down how much time I was giving to the site. So I've been very quiet on Twitter, and I kind of don't want to seem sort of like I'm contributing to this idea that everything's okay now. But also the other thing is, like Twitter was just becoming, and it still is, like you would probably, can you believe that there are academics and doctors and, serious, real people who are so rude to each other on Twitter now. And it, because of this issue of, if you say something, if I just put some data forward, people will just get stuck into me thinking that I'm saying that I want us all to lock down or something like that, or that I want there to be masks in schools, sort of thing, right? So I did want to take a little bit of a step back because of that, because you say one thing and people just get stuck into you for it. But in terms of, I think one of the traps that we fall into is this trap of, well, what are you saying, right? Like there are these little arguing circles where they're going around and around in circles saying, it's not over. And then the response is, well, what are we going to do about it? We've got to learn to live with COVID at some point. So it like goes to this extreme. So in terms of grappling with that, I mean, one thing that I want to start doing is returning to the interesting Twitter threads, and finding an interesting thing. Like, people have genuine questions. And my goal has always been, can we answer the question, right? Like, do we have the information to actually answer that question? So one question that I want to answer at the moment is the case fatality rate, a simple comparison of the case fatality rate in each state and territory, right? And then you can get onto the public record, states with pretty extreme restrictions like WA with the borders, their case fatality rate versus a state like New South Wales, where it's all learn to live with it sort of thing. Like, I think just trying our best to just answer the questions and collect the facts and just put it out there is really the only thing that we can do. And then try not to get it linked to, therefore do this, this, and this. Like, I'm pretty militant about not taking a policy position. I've never taken one, right? So yeah, like, I think that's really the main thing that I would say, is try to keep answering the questions about. So masks in schools is obviously really, really hard and huge. And I don't know what sort of questions we could answer in that respect, but you'd be better equipped to do it than I would, actually, because I really try to avoid that sort of stuff that requires expert knowledge.
Do you see a role for experts to start? I mean, I know you said a lot of them argue, which is true, but like, is there also a role or a responsibility or expectation to also be doing threads? Like, I know there's plenty of people I follow who are fatigued also probably of doing that as well, but I kind of worry about this, just like COVID's over, and it's not just here, it's a lot of places, and it's a comforting, hopeful thing to want. It's not necessarily reflective of the reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. And, you know, it all started back when we were told so many times by the politicians, just get the jab and everything will go back to normal, because they couldn't say that's not the way it might be. And so now there's this problem of everyone got the jab and they're like, we did it, we did what you said, and now we don't want to hear anything else about it. So I think there is a bit of an immovable object in that respect, and the foundations were laid last year when they said that. I think threads are very, very useful, because even if you only get like 15 or 20 likes, many more people have seen that than you know about. And it's also about influencing the audience that is on Twitter, and making them understand what the facts are, because, you know, most, like, they actually do want to know, they do want to understand if they work in media or news or something. So yeah, like, to be honest, when I started, I wasn't active on Twitter at the start because I thought, no, it's not for me. I'm going to collect the data, put it out there, and then the experts can use it, and that sort of thing. But yeah, like that, I guess that hasn't happened quite as much as I thought it would. And I think from an expert point of view, you know, this idea of enabling people to self-discover the logic is really, really powerful. And so rather than be like sort of Burnett Institute about it and be like, this and this, therefore we should do this, this and this, an emphasis on the facts and educating people, I think there's always going to be that will always be useful.
Yeah, agree.
You just need the time. It's really time consuming.
Yeah, but I think it's true, you know, even if it is just 15, 20 likes, like the reach will be a lot higher than you'll ever know.
100%.
And even if you can help 3 people understand better, that's 3 people that can then, you know, like it can sort of get exponential in some ways. That word.
Yes. And you never know what's going to take off as well. Like I do things where I'm like, oh, this will take off, and it just absolutely falls flat. And then something random will really take off. So you kind of need, it's unpredictable.
Amazing. Well, we've definitely gone way over time, but I think that just speaks to how engaging and interesting your talk was, and how, you know, thankful we are to get all of your insights. And yeah, just thank you again for an amazing presentation. And thanks to those who stuck around.
Yes, thank you to all of you, you know, hardcore believers for hanging around. Thank you. And thanks, Matt Bolton, for being there in the middle of my screen. Thanks for everything that you do.
Thank you so much. And as long as Juliette is all right with that, we'll share slides and the recording of this talk on our YouTube channels. So yeah, watch that space if you don't already follow us, and spread the word. Thank you so much. And everyone have a good evening. Have a nice dinner.
Thank you. You
You
too.
too.
Thank you so much. Bye.
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 See ya.